Composition to begin with. Obviously, we know that Module C as a whole is 20 marks. It's usually split up into 2 sections, but we know from last year's HSC that it's not necessarily going to be the case, right? You may be asked a 20-mark question on a specific form of writing, whether that's imaginative, persuasive, or discursive. So we now know for sure that it is very much possible that you get asked to do an imaginative specifically or a discursive specifically. You need to have some kind of draft prepared for each of those. What I will go on to explain is that you don't need to have a completely different idea for all 3 of those forms, though. You use one central idea from one core draft that you have in your preferred writing style, and then you have 2 variations. Okay, so you still include a lot of the stylistic elements and the concerns and the themes from your core piece, but you need to make, let's say you did an imaginative, you need to create a persuasive and a discursive variant, right, of those, or version of those. The question becomes, well, what is that key concern? What is that idea that I need to have in my composition, right? So let's say you're doing an imaginative, could be a discursive, could be a persuasive. Let's say it's an imaginative and you're basing it off a core text, right? You base it off a prescribed Module C text. Well, what you want to pay careful attention to in the core text is not simply the stylistic elements. Okay, it's not just how they wrote it, it's what they were talking about. And what I would personally do is I would stay very close to the concerns of the composer in that piece, right? So you don't just merely mimic how they wrote a piece by using imagery because they use lots of imagery, or using first-person narrative voice because they use first-person narrative voice. You do those things, and it's good to focus on 2 stylistic elements from a prescribed Module C text is what you need to make sure you are using a lot of in your piece, because you've got to make it very obvious that you're using it and you're trying to hone the craft of using that style of writing. The other thing, though, aside from stylistic elements that I'm touching on now, is that you need to look at the concern of the author. What was the composer concerned with when they wrote the composition that you're studying? Okay, so when you look at a prescribed text, what are some of the concerns that the author raises or the composer raises? So let's have some ideas now quickly, depending on, everyone's got different prescribed texts. Some may overlap, some may cross over. What are some of the core concerns that your composer is looking at? And you should be able to summarize it with like one core thing. Like, what is the one tension that your composer is writing about? Whether it's through the imaginative form, discursive, so it's like contemplating, or it's persuasive. Okay, so we've got Nam Le, if anyone has Nam Le. It doesn't matter if you didn't do these texts, we're just trying to figure out the purpose here. Okay, so identity, struggle for identity. Okay, great. So that's all you need to know. So what you then do is in your piece, you also want to write about a struggle for identity. Keep it nice and close to the text, but you also want to use at least 2 stylistic elements of Nam Le. You write an imaginative, you use 2 stylistic elements. What are 2 examples of stylistic elements in this text? First person narrative voice, that probably applies to a lot of other texts as well. So use of motifs, use of first person. Say they're the 2 stylistic elements, great. So you use those and you make it very obvious that you're using them, not in an unsophisticated way, but you just want to try and use it a lot, find opportunities to use those so the marker can see that. But then what you do is if you have the imaginative draft, which is about a struggle for identity, and I would actually base it around the key moment of tension in the text. So when you're doing the composition, you focus in on the key moment of tension in the actual text you studied. Because a lot of people will absorb the stylistic elements and then they're going to try and write about a random idea. Right, that's very difficult, and also you might get a question. Have a look at this question. It's a Nessa sample question, but it says choose a character, persona, or speaker from one of the texts, and then it says express the thought processes exploring a moment of tension in the text. So you could get a question that actually draws upon not just the stylistic elements, but actually the tension in the text. So my view is, even if you don't get a question that specific, why not do that anyway? So you're now prepared for both cases. Does that make sense? So if you haven't already made a draft that is surrounding the key moment of tension in the text that you're looking at for the stylistic elements, right, for how they've written, then I would make that adjustment as soon as possible. That's what you need to have with the composition, and then you need to craft together a discursive and a persuasive centered around the same concern. So if you're talking about the struggle for identity, right, the struggle for identity is an example for everyone listening. Right? If you have the struggle for identity and you write about you write in the imaginative form about a character in a setting who's struggling with their identity. It's a short moment in time, fine. Now you have them through the persuasive form trying to talk about in a persuasive way about a struggle to do with identity that relates to the story you had. So you just phrase it in a more persuasive way. We'll talk about how to actually make that adjustment. But my point here, my core point is, you don't develop 3 completely distinct drafts. You could do that, that's just so much work. Okay, so if you actually want to learn 3 drafts for each one that are completely different based on different stylistic elements, go ahead. It's just going to be very difficult to learn that. So I'm just trying to give you an efficient way of doing this.